So the next project we will do will be this AI-powered content generator and analyzer. And the idea behind this project is more to explain how the infrastructure of a similar project can be produced. This particular content generator is not exactly what I consider to be some kind of high quality product output, but it's there to teach you how to actually implement this type of a system. And then you can easily create or modify a custom version of it for yourself if you're actually trying to build something like this. Or if not, this project itself will be sufficient to just master these concepts. So like before, we will do an explanation of the project that we will build. I'll use a diagram and also show you the project itself, how it works. So the important aspects that I wanted to include in this project was how to approach this situation when you have multiple tasks that you want your service to run, and then utilizing Python's multithreading built-in library. And this is very, very important where you actually want to build something more sophisticated. So the first thing we will touch upon is Python's multithreading and semaphores, which will help optimize the performance, especially when dealing with this input-output bound tasks like making API calls or database operations. So by incorporating multithreading and semaphores, you can optimize the performance of your application. Important to note this bit here. This approach helps manage concurrent requests efficiently. So you can imagine, as you build a system like this, if you're dealing with what you will see here, you're not really increasing the overall performance of it, but as your system scales, this becomes so efficient. So you're improving the overall responsiveness of the system as it scales. So there is much on multi-threading that can be discussed about, and this video will be more about the implementation of it rather than just theory. But in a nutshell, multi-threading will allow multiple threads to run concurrently. So lastly, with semaphore, it is a synchronization primitive that controls access to a common resource by multiple threads. And in this project, semaphore is used to limit the number of concurrent API requests to the OpenAPI, preventing overload and managing rate limits effectively. So we will implement it in our utils.py file. You saw at this point, we kind of approach this file structure in a similar way for each project. And we always have this utils.py file where we include additional function aspect that is running our main.py file. So this is where we will do our semaphore initialization. So for now, we will do just 5 concurrent threads. So what is it used for? The semaphore usage, it block shows that each thread acquires the semaphore before making an API call. And this is the important part. After a certain threshold, additional threads will wait until one of the current threads releases the semaphore. So we'll have these 2 functions that will use semaphore. In our main.py file, we'll have our thread pool executor, and this manages the thread pool and executes the utility functions in separate threads. I'm going to leave this explanation here, pause it. There's no need for me just to read it out loud. Just by all means, pause the video and read this explanation for it. Moving on. So before we analyze the diagram that will explain our project, I'm going to go back to the actual project itself and show you how it works. So the idea is that you can enter any topic. So for example, if I was to enter right now Super Bowl and click generate content, this is now making a request call to OpenAI, and we receive some generic text that explains Super Bowl. And the idea is that by modifying this additionally, you can have this very quick one-button generated content on a topic of your request. So furthermore, our project here will have an ability to analyze the text, and we have 2 parameters, readability and sentiment. As you can see, since this is AI generated, the text coming back has quite a good readability score. But what's more important here is that it can actually comment on the sentiment of the text. So here I'm providing you the template of how you can utilize sentiment analysis for any particular purpose. Let's say you wanted to do Twitter post analysis. If you were to query each individual tweet, post, however you call it, it will give you the sentiment analysis of that, and you get like positive, neutral, negative. So you can see this adjective commentary on what Super Bowl is. So it correctly states that the sentiment of the text is neutral. If I was to go in a different direction, let's say we go through for a historic event, World War II casualties, click generate content. So now we have this text that speaks about the casualties in World War II. And if I go now and copy paste this into the box for content analysis and click analyze content, Now the sentiment of the text is negative, so clearly because it discusses the casualties in a war. Let's say I try to do something like successful operation. So this is just some kind of like to create a successful operation and then some key factors. And then because this is kind of positive advice on how to approach whatever, long story short, we can see that the sentiment of the text is positive. So our app works like intended, and we'll just break it down to this diagram of how things actually occur. So as you saw, we have this user interface, which is our web app. So this is our first part here. I will segment it like so and say this is number 1. And this is just our HTML elements. As you see, it's a simple HTML page. There's just a little bit of Bootstrap here to make the buttons look slightly more modern, but nothing special. I think I generated it with ChatGPT. So this triggers our JavaScript. So if you go back to this page and we look into the source. So if you look into the source and look at the JavaScript, you'll see there's a little bit of JavaScript here, which is basically just a couple of functions that will extract this text and forward it to our FastAPI app. So that's the JavaScript that we use here. So let's say this JavaScript could kind of allow number 2 stage. So now our data will land with our FastAPI backend. So with our FastAPI backend, we will include a schema validation. So that's not written anywhere here, but this definitely will start our stage 3. It starts with schema validation that makes sure the data that JavaScript forwarded with fetch method reaches our endpoints. And we will have 2 endpoints. So as you can see, we have generate endpoint and analyze endpoint, respectively representing 2 of the each input boxes, one giving an option for content generation and the other is the sentiment analysis. So the important part, which I will segment maybe as number 4, is the calls to the thread pool executor. So this is us controlling the processes and making sure that they run sequentially in a specific order and that the 6th one would not start before the semaphore actually allows it to. So after that, I would say that what we do have then is communicating with OpenAI API to retrieve the sentiment analysis, and then we can store it in a database. This is just the addition to consistently practice incorporating this Postgres database aspect of all of these projects. So we can store our content or sentiment analysis into a database. This will be our Postgres, and then it returns the data retrieval for displays. And then, as you saw, we get it back in our HTML page. So just to briefly comment on when and where multithreading and semaphore are used, because I believe this is effectively the reason why this project should be studied. So the trigger, user submits the form to generate content. And so this is the endpoint. So when we submit payload to this particular endpoint, the thread pool handles the request concurrently and uses semaphore to limit the number of concurrent API calls. And so, like I said, this is our first part, generate content. And then let me put like 1 and then 2 here. So the second one is when we do sentiment analysis, and what 4 is submitting the analyze content function to the thread pool to handle the request concurrently, just like with the previous one. So we use it for the same purpose in these 2 endpoints. By all means, also read this summary. It's useful information. And like I've said, it's very important that you are quite comfortable with dealing with multi-API requests concurrently and making order with a very unorganized situation, which could be a system that scales upwards. So semaphore. So that all being said, we went through our diagrams, some theory, and we can go and start writing some code. So you want to go to this particular GitHub repo. It'll be the link, the first link you see under the project. And you want to go and clone the repo. So you're going to copy URL and just go into your working directory and git clone this link. So we start together with the same file structure that you can see on the left-hand side in this video. So after you have done the git clone, you will have the app folder, templates folder, and .env.gitignore.requirements.txt. So first thing you want to do is create a virtual environment and activate the virtual environment, pip install all of this. So I already have that running in a different window, but I'm just going to give you a quick introduction on how to do that. I believe in the previous 2 videos we have done that. So you want to make sure that you're in the right folder. So the working directory, you will do Python and mvenv and then the name. So Once you have this, you want to activate this particular environment. So in PowerShell, I like to do it in PowerShell. So that will be scripts ps1 like so. And you can see the prefix .env, meaning that we have activated our virtual environment. We want to install all of these libraries. So what I'm going to do is pip install our requirements.txt. So you just leave this to run, and within a couple of minutes, you will have all of the dependencies ready to be used. So in your .env, you want to make sure that you have your sensitive data. So we will not hard code any of the sensitive data in our app code. Rather, we will use a particular dependency that allows us to use them in a safe way. So you want to make sure that your OpenAI API key is copy pasted here. And also with this project, we will be doing a database implementation. So you want to create a database with Postgres. And for that, I use pgadmin4. So if you open pgadmin4 in databases here, you want to create a database. And as you can see, I already created this AI gen database. So you do the same and make sure that then in your .env, you write this particular variable, database URL. So we will say that we are using Postgres, and then you want to put username, password, the address, which will be localhost port 5432, which is the default one, and then the last slash is the name of the database. You do the exact same format. And like I've said above, you just copy paste your API key from OpenAI dashboard. So that's all you need for your .env file. Right, we're moving on. So we can see that all of our dependencies have been successfully installed. So we can start coding our app. So the first thing we'll do is create our files. So we will create the main.py. We will have a CRUD.py, database.py, utility, schemas, and models. So these are all the files that we'll need in our app folder. And just before we start writing the backend logic, I will quickly skim over the front-end stuff. Front-end stuff is not relevant for this project, so you should just use it from the Git clone provided with the description. But just to briefly skim over what's going on here, so the Bootstrap we are using it through the link. There is some CSS styling just to make this project work in the way we want it to work. You have your standard HTML which gives us forms, so we can take the input from the user, and the submit form will then execute some JavaScript. The JavaScript itself is nothing more than a fetch function that will take the payload, do a post request, send it to a specific endpoint, which in this case will be our FastAPI endpoint. I believe that's sufficient in terms of how much we need to talk about the front end. Back to us coding our backend now. So first things first, I like to kind of get the generic stuff that we always do in the same way out of the way. So what we'll do, we'll go into database.py. So we will import what we need here. So we are using SQLAlchemy. So the dependency injections will be done with these particular variables, and write these. Also use OS because we'll be working with files, and what we said earlier, we are using .env to store our sensitive data. So the dependency that will enable us to use that is .env. So make sure we import that. We want to load this environment, so we'll say load.env, and then we want to import our variables that store our sensitive data. So we'll say that the database URL is, and then we use the OS framework to actually access that file. So get environment, and the name of it is database URL. So now we want to create the SQLAlchemy engine, and we will say that the engine is just create engine, and we are passing the database URL. So creating a configured session class, session local. So we have session maker, and we'll pass these three parameters. And then at the end, we'll say that the base equals declarative base. So this is our database.py. And we can close it. We're not going to need to open this anymore. So for our main.py now, we'll go there, and we'll first deal with the imports. So we want to use these three from FastAPI. To be able to render our HTML page, we want to import this particular templates. And we're importing our ORM, which is SQLAlchemy session. And we want to make sure that we can work with all of the files from our app folder. So we are importing models, CRUD, database, utility, and schemas. So these are the files in the folder respectively. And we want to make sure that from database, we import engine and session local. And lastly, from starlet concurrency, we import run in thread pool. We'll write models.base.metadata create all to bind the engine. and call our app, which is the FastAPI, so store it in app variable. We want to make sure that this app knows where to look for our template files. So to be able to render the HTML file, the front end, we want to say that go and look into the templates folder. So that's the directory where we'll store our front end stuff, which is, if you look at the left hand side where the file structures are, you can see where our HTML file is right there. So to do dependency injection next, we can use the same thing. So I always copy paste this from the actual website. To get our dependency injections, we'll just be passing this getDB parameter with our endpoint methods. So lastly, now we can actually write our endpoints. So the main endpoint will just read our HTML page and render it. So that's what it does. We'll name it accordingly, read root. It has a request, and the return is just template response, giving the template that we have there. Now we wanna, so we said we will have two endpoints that will effectively do all the work. So that'll be our post endpoint on /generate. So this is for generating content, and we want to asynchronously define this method. We're calling it generate content, and we are making sure that the data that travels from the front end is validated by our schemas. So we still have not written this. So now we will go into schemas and make sure that the request body that comes gets validated by this particular parameter from schemas and stores in payload variable here. So this is how we will access the data that goes onto this particular endpoint. And then the second parameter is our dependency injection. And as you saw, we defined that here. So this is what allows us to actually have the connection to the database. But like we said, we have our payload here, and we need to make sure that it gets validated. And I always like to just use Pydantic schemas for that. So going into our schemas.py, we will import base model from Pydantic, and we will have a bunch of classes now to validate our data. So we have this one that takes the first input, which will just be a string. So it gives the topic that we want to generate content about. And then the second one for sentiment analysis, it's also a string. So we're just making sure that whatever comes, it's a particular one variable, and the type, the data type is a string. And if you think about it, do we really need schemas at this point? No, not really. But as this tutorial kind of aims to teach the basic architecture structure of a particular web app that functions like this, we try to establish it as a practice, as a habit, as a good practice of creating high standard of API systems. So after we have our schemas, we'll go back to our main.py. And under generated text, we will store what this particular method returns. So as we mentioned earlier, we are importing this run in thread pool from starlet.concurrency. And the parameters we're passing is a particular function from utility, our dependency injection, and the topic from the payload. So this third parameter is what comes from the front end, the input from the user. The dependency injection is our connection to the database. And the one that we still have not written is the generate content function from utility. So that's what we'll do next. So if we go into utility.py, we want to make sure we import everything that we need. So you want to import OpenAI OS. Just like with the other files, we're importing session and loading our sensitive data in load.tnv. We're using CRUD and models files from our app file, from our app folder. We are importing threading and thread pool executor. Once again, we want to establish the connection to our sensitive data. We will be using the OpenAI key. So this is how you're going to do that. Just like with the database URL, we are establishing that here. And what I consider to be the pivotal moment of this particular project is to explain that here is the moment we define a semaphore to limit the number of concurrent threads. So just for this example, we are doing a particular number 5. So we'll be running 5 threads. And then if there is a 6th one, it actually waits for one of these to finish. So now we want to write our generate content function. So what we'll do is have it with our dependency injection and the topic, the string that gets passed from the front end, and the return will be a string as well. So with semaphore, we'll say that the search term is crud.getSearchTerm, and this will have the two parameters of the dependency injection and the topic. And as you can see, we still have not touched our crud.py file. So we need to make sure now we have this particular method written in our crud.py. Going to our crud.py, we will just import these two particular lines, And then we'll write our create search term method. So it will have the same parameters. And we're going to say that the DB search term is models search term, which is the term. So as you can see now, as we are creating this flow, we are kind of jumping from a file to file, but I believe it's important that you have an idea of how the thought process usually is when you are creating these endpoints and modifying specific utility, adding functionality to it. So now we'll go into our models and write our tables. So going into models.py, we want to import a couple of things. So from SQLAlchemy, we'll import this particular column, integer, string, foreign key, and text. We'll import relationship because we'll be using a relational concept when it comes to creating these tables. And our first table will be our search terms. So we want to store that. So we'll say that the table name is search terms. And this is how I've generated this. So it will have an ID. The ID is the primary key, the term, which is what gets passed from the user. And then we have the generated content that returns to be displayed in the front end aspect for the user. And also we have sentiment analysis. So this is what we're storing in our database called search terms. Then our second table is called generated content. And this takes from a particular line from the table we just created previously, our search terms table. And it also has its own ID, this the content. And then we have the search term ID and the search term, which has the relationship with the search term table. And our third table for sentiment analysis, it also has ID, readability, sentiment. So these are the outputs that you saw in our front-end app are returned to the user when they do sentiment analysis. And we are also storing the ID and the search term in this table. So that's our models.py. If you need to, you can just pause and make sure that you have written this in the same way. I'm going to make sure that everything is visible in a way that you can just pause and go over it. So I believe now in the video, if you pause, everything is visible. So going back to where we were. So as you can see, if you look at the files that are open here, main, CRUD, utility, schemas, and models, this was the workflow whilst we were trying to write this endpoint. So we can effectively close them one by one and go where we were. So the last one that we were working on was utility.py, and we will finish off writing our generate content function. So if this is null, we'll say that the search term, if this is not null, CRUD create search term, and this has the same two parameters. So now we want to make sure that we can actually access the OpenAI API. So in our response variable, we will store OpenAI.chatCompletion, and we will write these particular parameters. So what's getting passed to OpenAI is your Be My Assistant and write a detailed article about, and we are passing the topic that the user has chosen. We will store that in generated text, and we will say is that generated text equals response choices with index 0 and the message content. We'll use strip to do some formatting of the string, and we want to access now in our CRUD create generated content and pass the dependency injection generated text and search term.id. So this is now a method that we still have not created. So we'll go to our CRUD.py and create this method. So going back there, we see that we still have not finished our create search term method. So what we just need to add here is these 3 lines, which is the way how this particular ORM, SQLAlchemy, will actually insert this data into the database. It always needs a commit and refresh after that. And we can just say return db search term. So that's our first method defined. And very similarly, now we are doing the create generated content method. And with this one, we'll say that the db generated content is models. And from models, we get generated content, and we say that content is content. We will also add that this is search term ID. We'll add the same 3 lines from above here, which allows us to actually do the insertion of data into our database. Sorry, wrong copy paste. So the one with db generated content. And at this point, we'll just return db generated content. So now we can go to our utility.py, and as you can see, we are accessing this method that we have just written, create generated content. Lastly, this will return generated text. So we go back to our main.py and finish off defining our endpoint. So after generated text, we just want to return that our generated text is the variable of generated text. So I believe we have everything we need to actually test this. So this particular endpoint. So if we go and run our FastAPI app. So we'll go into folder app and we'll write uvicorn main app reload. So our app is running. So if we go and open our endpoint for rendering our HTML and we enter some kind of a topic here, so I'll just do something very random. I'll say New York and click generate content, and after approximately like 5-10 seconds we can see that we have our results returned. So we have this information about New York. So we still now have to do the second part, which is make sure that this particular input will reach our second endpoint. So we have to create that second endpoint. All right then, so quite similar to what we have already done. So we'll just copy paste the previous post and modify what we need to modify. So instead of endpoint generate, it'll be endpoint/analyze. Instead of the function called generate content, it'll be called analyze content. The schemas we'll be using will be analyze payload, and the dependency injection can remain exactly the same. Then instead of just creating generated text, we are creating two variables. And again, we are using running thread pool, but when we reach into utility file, we'll be using analyze content variable. So as you can see, we do not have this method written yet. So that's what we'll do next. We'll go into utility.py, and now we'll create our function that can do content analysis. So call it like that, call it analyze content, because that's what we've written in our main.py endpoint. And again, we will be using semaphore. So with semaphore, we'll say that our search term is CRUD.getSearchTerm. So as you can see, we do not have this method. So we shall go in CRUD.py and write it now. So going there, we'll say that the method getSearchTerm takes two parameters, and they are a database session and a string called term. And it will just return from our database. So we'll use SQLAlchemy here, and we will query through our models a database table called search term, and we want to filter models search term dot term, and it will be the exact term, and we want to return the first. So we will save that and go back into our utility and see that this thing went green now, from white to green, meaning that this method can now be used. Next, we will say if this is not null, then we actually want to do a CRUD operation and create this search term. So we are entering that into our table, and we want to say that readability is the output of the getReadabilityScore method, which takes the content parameter. So we do not have this function yet, so we're going to define it here. So we're going to say that this takes content, which is the string, and it returns a string. ReadabilityScore, which is good. So this can be something you modify and play with yourself. So you can see that within utility, you can add any additional functionality. So you would actually have to find a way to connect an API that can do a readability score. So this will be your place for it. So if available, replace with actual readability call. The one that we will use with our OpenAI is the sentiment, and we'll do get sentiment analysis. So just like we did with readability score, we will create that here. And we'll say that the get sentiment analysis takes content as a string and gives us a string output. And in this response, we will again use OpenAI's AI. So we're using ChatGPT 3.5 Turbo, and this is the message just saying, be my assistant and analyze the sentiment of the following text. And we are passing the content that we have just generated previously. And you want to make sure you actually know how much tokens you're using with this. You don't want to just burn through it. So I'm limiting it to 10. After that, we will return the response of choices. And again, with some formatting using strip. Well, this indentation is not right. So you want to make sure the indentation is right. So just have a quick check over. You don't do the same mistake I just did a second ago. So now we have our get sentiment analysis function. So just to recap, this is an actual function that works properly with the readability score. You are free to improvise with this and play around, implement the readability API here. You will do it in the exact way how this is done with the sentiment analysis. So within the response variable, you will make an API call, pass it certain parameters. You can read the API documentation of your readability AI, and then return the response that it gives. So going back to our analyze content function, after we have done readability and sentiment analysis, we will do some CRUD operations. So we want to store all of that, and we are just saying create sentiment analysis. This is the method that we'll create right now, and the parameters we're passing is our dependency injection and the readability sentiment files, but also the ID, because if you remember, we are using a relational concept here when it comes to our tables. So now we want to create the sentiment analysis method. So going into CRUD, we will do create sentiment analysis. The parameters are the dependency injection, readability is string, and the ID, which is an integer. And here we want to say that our variable called sentiment analysis, basically just like the line from our create generated content function, this one here. So it'll be very similar. So I'm just going to do that. It goes into models of sentiment analysis table, and readability is readability, and you can see where this is going, just like with the previous one, ending with adding the search term ID. Then we want to do our CRUD operation, specifically create. So we are going into the database, we are adding this particular payload, and you always have to do commit and refresh. And then it's just returning the variable that we created here. So it will return DB sentiment analysis. So we have everything we need in our CRUD, I believe now. And we can close it. To finish off our utility.py, we want to go back to where we were, which is this line. So we have just created this particular function, and as you can see, it went green. So it means it's connected, and we just want to return these two variables. So if you remember, we have this readability and sentiment, and we want to return those two. So we'll say readability and sentiment. So I believe with these 4 functions, we have finished our utility.py file as well. So 1, 2, 3, 4, that's correct. So we can close utility.py as well. Going back to our main py to finish off defining the second endpoint, the post one, we want to now return the data that we have produced with readability and sentiment. So we will just say that readability is readability, sentiment, and this will be in the form of a JSON, or it's an object, like so. So what remains now is to test the second endpoint, and if everything works, then we will also just check the CRUD operations, do they operate properly, and insert the data into our database. And if all of that works, that's our project finished. So we are saving this, our app is running, so we will open our app and test it. We will do, for example, London, click generate content and wait. So we have some information about London, and now we want to do sentiment analysis. We expect it to be positive because this is all like superlative of London. So if we copy paste that into our analyze content and click analyze content, we see that it says that the sentiment of the text is positive. So everything works here as we want it to. Now all we want to see is if we open our pgadmin4 and check into our database, did this London information get accordingly stored in our database? So doing that, I'm going to refresh my database and going into my tables. First, I'll do search terms. So if I return all rows, and I've been testing a lot of things, as you can see, but at the bottom, you can see that there is London. So everything works right here. Doing the same for our generated content, and I do return all rows, and we see that the content text exploring the vibrant city of London. And now we want to make sure that the third analysis table also works properly, and we can see that it gives us the last sentiment of the text is positive, which is consistent with what we just saw. So everything in this project works as we intended. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something, and we'll see you in the next one.